I want to start today with a question that I hear all the time, especially from CEOs, from founders, and finance leaders, because it usually shows up either when budgets tighten or when pipeline pressure starts to creep in. And it sounds something like this. Should we be investing in branding or should we just focus on sales? And every time that question comes up, I know that we're framing the problem the wrong way because branding versus sales isn't actually a choice. It's a false trade off. And when companies force themselves into that corner, they almost always end up weakening both sides instead of strengthening either one. And what I find really interesting is that the question isn't usually asked because people don't believe in brands, but it's being asked because people are nervous. They're nervous about revenue, they're nervous about predictability, and they're nervous about defending decisions if things don't go exactly as planned. And so today I want to unpack why this debate keeps resurfacing in B2B, what buyer behavior actually tells us about how decisions get made, and why companies that get this right stop arguing about brand versus sales altogether. This is Spark Sessions, the podcast for marketers and business leaders who are done chasing tactics and who are ready to understand what's really driving buyer behavior today. I'm Lori Taylor, and after more than 25 years in B2B marketing, both inside of large organizations and now as a fractional CMO, I have learned that marketing usually doesn't fail because teams aren't working hard. It fails because the rules have changed quietly, but no one has bothered to update the playbook. And that is exactly what's happening with this whole brand versus sales conversation. So let's start with why this debate even exists in the first place. In B2B, sales feels very concrete. You can see the pipeline, you can see opportunities moving through the stages, you can point to deals and say, yeah, that activity led to revenue, even if the attribution isn't perfect. Branding, on the other hand, feels much fuzzier. It takes time, it doesn't produce immediate results. And when pressure is high, anything that doesn't show a straight line to revenue feels risky. But here's the part that gets overlooked. The very reason that branding feels risky internally is the same reason that buyers rely on it so heavily. B2B buyers are not impulsive. They're not bold. And they are certainly not running around trying to be heroes because most B2B decisions come with, real professional risk. Someone has to explain the decision. Someone has to stand behind it. And God forbid something goes wrong, someone has to own the outcome and take accountability. So buyers do what any rational person would do in that situation. They look for safety. They look for familiarity. They look for signs that tell them, well, other smart people trust this company, so I'm not going to be sticking my neck out by choosing them. Guess what? That's brand. That is brand in action. Brand is the quiet force that shapes how safe a decision feels before anybody ever fills out a marketing form or takes a sales call. It's what determines whether that outbound email that you sent feels like an interruption or an opportunity. And it's what determines whether a buyer enters a sales conversation feeling curious or being guarded. And yet, so many companies treat brand as optional, something that you invest in once sales is figured out, or something that you do later when there's extra budget or when growth slows and you need a refresh. But what decades of research and so much lived experience show us is just the opposite. Strong B2B brands don't just win more deals, they make every part of the sales process easier. Sales cycles shorten, price sensitivity drops, fewer stakeholders need convincing. And when things go sideways in the market, it's the strong brands that recover faster. So, brand doesn't replace sales, it changes the conditions under which sales happen. So, let's talk about some of the challenges in this debate because there are a few of them. And one of the biggest challenges I think I see is that companies think of brand as a campaign instead of as an operating system. They'll invest in a rebrand, they'll redesign the website, they'll run a few awareness campaigns. But then when revenue doesn't immediately spike, they conclude that brand doesn't work. But brand isn't supposed to work like that. It isn't supposed to work like a switch that you flip. It works like gravity. You don't notice when it's doing its job, but you dang well feel it immediately when it's missing. When brand is weak, everything else just feels harder. The sales conversations start with skepticism instead of trust. And buyers ask for more proof and more references and more comparisons and more justification. And the pricing conversations get more tense and discounts become expected. And every deal just feels like it requires this heroic effort. The fix here is understanding what brand is actually responsible for. Brand is meant to reduce friction. It is meant to reduce perceived risk. It reduces the amount of convincing later. And so when brand is doing its job, sales doesn't have to establish legitimacy. They just get to focus on it. Another challenge I see all the time is just extreme inconsistency. So many B2B companies who say that they care about brands, but then they allow these just wildly different stories to exist across the website, their sales decks, their thought leadership, and even in the way that the executive team talks about the company. And buyers notice this, even if they can't put their finger on it, because inconsistency creates doubt, and doubt is poison in a buying process. So you need to seek out alignment. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be coherent, in your positioning, in your value story, and your point of view. They all need to feel like they come from the same place, no matter where your buyer finds you. And when buyers repeatedly hear the same narrative, it becomes familiar. And that familiarity is a huge driver of trust. Another challenge is the measurement challenge that really fuels this debate, because brand impact many times, most times, I guess I would say, shows up indirectly. It shows up in things like higher win rates, in shorter sales cycles, in fewer competitive bake-offs, maybe greater pricing power. And those inbound leads that are coming in, they will arrive already educated and already inclined to trust you. But because those outcomes don't always show up immediately after a brand campaign launches, Organizations end up underestimating or just completely devaluing their impact. And so the answer isn't pretending that brand is unmeasurable. It's knowing that you have to measure it differently. And as companies mature, the correlation between brand strength and revenue performance becomes much, much clearer. The strongest organizations can draw that line. And, sometimes it does take months, sometimes it takes years, but they will be able to draw that line between brand investment and business outcomes. And then there's maybe the biggest challenge of all, which is fear. B2B buyers are cautious. B2B leaders are cautious. Marketing leaders, in particular, feel a tremendous amount of pressure to justify every dollar that we spend. So organizations will end up overcorrecting. They pour everything into bottom of the funnel sales activity, hoping that all the extra activity, all of the extra volume is going to compensate for trust. But what they don't realize is that without a strong brand, sales has to work twice as hard for half the results. Because every conversation then starts from zero. Every objection has to be overcome manually. Every deal feels so fragile. We have to acknowledge that recognizing that brand creates permission. It makes buyers receptive. It changes the emotional starting point of the sales conversation. When a brand is strong, again, sales doesn't have to then convince buyers that you're credible. Buyers already come to the table believing that. And so sales just gets to focus on their sales thing, if whether you're the right partner or not. So if you're the one asking or if you're the one being asked whether you should invest in branding or in sales, here's the reframe that I want to leave you with. Brand is not a luxury. It is not a vanity exercise. And it's not something that you earn the right to do after you hit your number. Brand is the invisible hand that's shaping buyer decisions long before the sales conversation ever happens. It's the reason why some companies will get the benefit of the doubt while other companies have to fight for every inch of ground. The smartest B2B organizations don't choose between brand and sales. They use brand to make sales inevitable. And once you really understand that, the debate, thankfully, starts to disappear. So, thank you for listening. This has been Spark Sessions. I hope that was helpful. If you found this at all valuable, please consider giving it a review, subscribe to my channel, and you can always find additional coursework, including my entire strategy academy on sparkpointmarketing.pro. Thank you so much for listening.